you all. It's great to be in Livingston. My sons are here making a movie. Some of my best friends are here. Some of my oldest friends, Doug Peacock and Andrea and Rick Bass and Scott McMillian, and a lot of people I only know casually, and a whole bunch of you I don't know at all. So it's a tribute. It's just fun to be in Livingston. Always fun to be in Livingston. Can you hear me way back in the couches over there? Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, I'm just going to start reading the preface of this book, which kind of explains it better than I would. And I want to mention the first thing that is quoted in this book is a quote from Jim Harrison. And I just want to send my sympathy to Jim and to his family. I know this is a really hard time for them all. And we're so sorry. The, what do you call the little epilogue? Is that what you call the thing in front of a book? No, just the few words. Epigraph. See, I have my sons around all the time to correct me. Anyway, this is a line from W.S. Merwin, who is also not doing so well in Hawaii, and so my heart goes to him too. Time unseen, time our continuing fiction, however we tell it, eludes our dear hope and our reason. Oops. Is this okay? Yeah. The poet and novelist Jim Harrison has said he measures the passage of time by the dogs he has had. Oh, by the way, I noticed there's a dog here. And welcome dog. I would have brought my own dog Lulu, who's in the Marie Hotel, if I had known. The poet and novelist Jim Harrison has said he measures the passage of time by the dogs he has had. So do I. The worst thing about dogs, Jim also said, is we outlive them. Hopefully not much longer. Having passed the 75-year mark, both Harrison and I are ready for the moment when our pooches will outlive us. If not this batch, surely the next. And being the lost instead of the loser may be a good thing. Let them cry over us. Writing about animals, said the poet Mark Doty in his memoir, Dog Years, is an attempt to bring something of the inchoate into the world of the represented. This is an impossible task. We who tell stories about the animals we love are trying to bridge the void between beings that live full lives without language as we know it, and those of us immersed in words. We know the gap cannot be bridged, and yet we are compelled to give it a try. It is like writing about love, which, Doty says, is our most common version of the unsayable. Dogs may not be aware of the fragility of their humans, but we owners of pets are aware of the predictable mortality of our animal companions. Such knowing does not stop a lover of animals. Love, we have learned, is the price of love, and love is what we are after, no matter the pain. Which brings me to Bruno, the chocolate lab, who will be a major character in this book. That's him. My traveling companion on the journey that is its core and one of the loves of my life. Bruno was 4 years old when this story began. He weighed 95 pounds and had functional testicles. Very functional. His head was massive, his eyes yellow, and his muzzle soft and pink. Russet at the ears with fur colors deepening to chocolate brown, he was tall for a lab and strongly muscled. Although Bruno could seem fearsome, especially when charging straight at you with his neck fur raised, he acted like a giant pup and would remain mellower than any dog I've had, to the point of marshmallow-dom. Bruno loved people, especially young women. Also Kevin, our neutered black cat, who he tried to bugger. He was a talking dog, making moaning sounds, high-pitched and keening, or low and guttural, which he expected you to comprehend. Like Chewbacca, my son Alec explained. I looked blank. The big hairy creature in Star Wars? Oh, the lovable monster. I will skip some. Although I don't equate parents with pets, the pattern of loss is similar. To paraphrase Harrison, the worst thing about parents is most of us outlive them. Having lost my husband, Dave Smith, when I was 38 and my father in my 60th year, I felt lucky as I turned toward 70 to have a mother nearly 100 years old. I had not always been so grateful. After my father died, my mother moved to a senior residence on Chicago's North Side. She was 90 and had embarked on a new life. But the only place she acknowledged as home was our beach house on a dune overlooking Lake Michigan near the small southwestern Michigan town of Sawyer. "It is paradise," she said in her emphatic Hungarian accent. My paradise. During her last years, my sisters and I took turns to visit and care for our mother, and if weather permitted, we took her to Sawyer. I usually flew from Montana to Chicago, but in May of 2003, I decided to drive. Mother was 97 and still relatively vital. That journey across the plains and back to Montana is the center of this book, but circles of memory and event ripple from it, continuous, still running. The only companion I had was Bruno, the perfect pal for an aging woman returning to her mother's house. Now I'm going to skip the dying part, both my mother and Bruno's, and go on. Bruno is the dog star of this story and essential to my narrative. While driving across the vast spaces of the interior West, I often got lost in memory or flights of fancy. Bruno's presence and his needs forced me to return to the actual. He reminded me that I, too, am an animal whose existence depends on being alert to the scents and sights and hungers and emotions of the moment. Through constant company in an enclosed space, I had hoped to inch closer to understanding this dog's way of being, observing my mysterious animal as the Cape people observed theirs, fascination with animals being as old as our species, and the inspiration for our first and perhaps greatest expressions in art. I only partially succeeded. I learned that dogs have memories, instincts, fears, moods, loyalties, and hatreds. They are like us in these ways. But as far as I know, dogs do not get swept up in nostalgia, speculation, or self-analysis. And although they have hopes, they are not driven by regrets. Which is why in a story narrated by a woman beset by the processes of aging and the imminence of death, the dog who rides shotgun is, like Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, a reminder of the physical realities outside of our imaginations. He is a connoisseur of scent trails that branch sideways or backward, uphill or down, always serpentine from any straight path. I cannot know what advice Bruno would have offered if he were instructing me about how to write this book, but I like to think he would tell me to follow my nose. Life, he might say, bounds like furtive, delicious rabbits across every step of our way. Heading toward 80, it is easy to fall into stories about nostalgia and loss, but that world I encounter is as new and present as everyone's. In the pages that follow, I have put together a mix of travel and relationship, Western history and family history, human love and animal love that centers around the 2 weeks I took to visit my mother. It is a chain of linked meditations, often triggered by place, about how the past impinges on the present and how that present can exist seemingly some past. Like everyone, I arrange memories, sensations, and thoughts in stories to define myself and those I love. Then I discover those stories are unstable and changing and filled with surprises, but there is consistency in them, the singular voice. I speak for myself, but as any character in my stories will tell you, I cannot see life whole or true, so experience reinvented will have to suffice. One twist at the kaleidoscope at memory's core causes the shards to fragment and repattern, but they are always the same shards. Now I see triangles and deep blue holes. Tomorrow there may be butterflies. That is how I believe stories work. They must be both startling and predictable, like every day's dawn. So now I'm going to read a little piece. So then I get on the road. It tells about going on the road and starting across Montana. And it's a very free associative book. I see a place, I think of something, makes me think of something else, and I get back to that place, and that's how it goes the whole way. So don't expect a straight narrative. You're not going to get it. Jordan. We drive into Jordan, a prairie town clustered like a herd of sheep among engulfing grasslands, population 364 and dwindling. I am struck by a sense of isolation as tangible as the scattered trailers in weedy lots, the shacks and painted bungalows with their pickups and snowmobiles. Dusty shade trees and wind-blown garden plots are poignant in their impermanence, while the paved main street sports a false front bar, a cafe, a few stores, and a Ford dealership. From its edges, the town tumbles onto arid plains with no other settlement in sight. 50 miles to the next gas, the next store. Jordan is the only real town in Garfield County, which is the size of Connecticut and carries a population of about 1,500. This adds up to a density of about 0.35 persons per square mile. In the booming 1920s, the county's 5,000 residents occupied 1,530 homestead farms, averaging 571 acres. Recently, there were fewer than 300 farms or ranches, each averaging about 7,000 acres. Not enough land for a cattle or sheep rancher to make a decent living. Hate grows like thistles in the cracked soil of such despair. Jordan, for example, is where in 1996, armed men and women who called themselves the Freemen defied the sheriff in a standoff lasting 81 days, refusing to pay taxes. They declared themselves a separate government and shone in media lights until the FBI dispersed them and police jailed the leaders. But I have only good memories of Jordan. This is where Bill's car broke down on a long-ago trip and where the motel proprietor asked if we were paleontologists. The area is famous for its dinosaur digs. Yes, we said, paleontologists for sure. While waiting for a new fuel pump to arrive from Billings, we borrowed a Ford pickup from the car dealer and drove north to Fort Peck to visit its mammoth earth-filled dam. We did not find prehistoric bones around the many-fingered reservoir, but we did see a hardhat tree. It sat in front of a prefab cabin on the False Lake's rocky shores. An old juniper hung with safety helmets colored yellow, red, fluorescent orange, blue, artifacts of the tribe of construction workers whose Riviera this is. In the slanted light of dusk, the hard hats glowed like strange fruit against a landscape that looked to my unschooled eyes as barren as the moon. Jordan is the town where Greg Hemingway, youngest son of Ernest, came to doctor at the doctorless clinic, driving about 200 miles from Bozeman each week. When he was caught dressed in drag at the hell-roaring bar, I imagine a flounced red dress and high heels, he fled home. But the town wanted him. They ran an ad in the Bozeman Chronicle, "Come back, Dr. Hemingway." He ignored their plea. "We didn't care what he wore," said the nurse at the clinic. "We needed a doctor. Ask anyone." Greg was a talented writer, and his slim book, Papa, is an expose of the tragic effects of fame on the father and on the son. Greg came to live with his own son, a student at the University of Montana in Missoula in the early 80s. In those days, Missoula was a haven for hard-drinking, partying, mostly macho writers, and Bill Kittredge tried to help Greg out of legendary jams, such as appearing in hot pants and heels in the ladies' locker room of the Missoula Athletic Club. But nothing could stop his self-destructive rampage. I met him near the end of his Missoula days, expecting an exotic character, and was surprised to encounter a small, gray-bearded, nondescript fellow. This was at a literary event at the university where Greg was heckling a respected elderly woman poet, Ripley Hugo, shouting, "Your time's up, I came to hear Bill Kittredge." Poor Greg's heart gave out in a Miami jail. He had undergone a sex change operation in middle age and taken the name Gloria. The newspaper reported that Gloria had been picked up on the median strip of a Miami freeway wearing only high heels and panties. Indigent at his death and as powerless as the street people who shared his cell, the youngest child of Ernest Hemingway left an estate of $5.3 million for his children and ex-wife to fight over. When I read the news, I could not help thinking that Greg Gloria should have stayed in Jordan, where extinct beasts and misfits are tolerated as long as they offer something of value. Now I'm going to read, because my sons are here, kind of a much more sentimental and personal little piece. I drove all the way across. I was on two lanes exclusively. I didn't want to go on freeways. To the border of Minnesota and South Dakota. And there's a rest stop there called the Waterton Oasis. And the section is called Lilacs. I'm only going to read parts of it. I'm not going to read the whole section. It's kind of long. Lilacs. I pull in at the Waterton Oasis. The air is humid and warm, grass a lush green. A 6-foot hedge of blooming purple lilacs separates the dog run from the cement block lavatory and picnic grounds. Bruno zigzags along scent trails of pheasant or quail while I search for remains of the farmhouse that was here before the freeway. I find only lilacs. The original settler's wife must have planted these rows with their heart-shaped leaves, a woman in homegrown gingham looking out at the prairie, lonesome, homesick, longing for the perfume of an older world. I will plant a wall of lavender, she thinks, and it will keep me from blowing away. Or perhaps the windbreak was a man's notion, a widower mourning his wife's death. He walks among the blossoms every May and remembers his love. Or maybe they were planted by a young man hoping to lure his beloved with a forest of flowers. Deep purple French double lilacs were my flower of choice when I was in high school. My friends and I cruised alleys in Wilmette in my mother's red '53 Chevy convertible. We stole armloads of the fragrant fence-hugging branches to decorate our junior prom. Later, when I attended the University of Chicago, my soon-to-be husband Dave Smith and I used to kiss behind a tall lilac hedge behind the tennis courts. Our passions were infused with the perfume of lilacs. Although my complex and restless young husband had been filled with competing ambitions from his college days onward, he also harbored a simple desire for home and land. Montana was the spur. In the 1970s, people like us could afford to buy some acres, own horses, and build a house by hand. So that's what we did. Despite failing health and a foreshortened future, Dave could be a rider of horses, a man on a tractor, a homesteader. Teenage Eric, my oldest son, so closely tuned to his father, he could tease him with impunity, reverse the usual father-to-son question. What do you want to be when you grow up? Dave answered with his ironic smile, I want to be a cowboy. He wasn't the only one. I jumped at the chance to play woman homesteader, bandana instead of bonnet, worn Levi's and muddy boots. I've written in previous books about how we bought the quarter section of meadow and woods above Bear Creek, and how when the original log house burned down before we could move into it, we crowded into a one-room bunkhouse and, with the help of friends, dismantled and rebuilt a 2-story hewn log house we'd found abandoned 30 miles up the Blackfoot. No need to repeat myself. What I want to stress here is Dave's vision and persistence. Sick as he was the driving force. Eric and Steve, those are my two oldest sons, Dave's students and colleagues, my family, our friends in Seattle, put on overalls and joined in the work. Dave's homesteader dream swept all of us into a communal venture that changed all of our lives. So then I'm going to write about going to LA to try and make it in the movies, and which was a total failure, but my sons are doing it. And I got to do a little bit of it. And then we came home. Our Hollywood pilgrimage ended as March ended, with a surge of homesickness and the urgent desire to witness spring in Montana. We packed our 2 suitcases of summer clothes, the twins' coloring books and toy soldiers, Steve's backpack and faux rubber mattress, and Dave's Olivetti and scripts into our second-hand Ford and headed home. When we crossed Lookout Pass from Idaho into Montana, all of us were singing our favorite Woody Guthrie song, "This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island." We were so happy to be coming home to our land. Then 4 days after his 41st birthday, on May 8th, 1974, Dave was irrigating our meadow, a thing he loved to do. It was a sun-struck afternoon, the meadow wet with runoff, brilliant with new grass, and popping with yellow buttercups and purple shooting stars. Happy in irrigating boots and mud-soaked jeans and making plans for a Memorial Day party, Dave came into our kitchen to wash hands before dinner. I see him there by the kitchen sink, turning to me with a surprised look, always turning, forever surprised. "Oh dear," he said. Then he fell face first to the maple floor, but bloodying his nose. The 6-year-old twins watched from the stairs while I tried to revive him with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. None of us has gotten over this yet. You couldn't have done a thing, the doctor told me. He was gone when he fell. Dave's heart just stopped. The cause was electrical failure. He was only 41 years old. When it came time to bury him, 2 of my best friends and I decided to plant lilac bushes by Dave's grave. The grave had been dug in Missoula's old Catholic cemetery, a sloping hillside that falls below the freeway and looks over a working-class neighborhood on the north side of the tracks. I chose to bury Dave here rather than in the newer cemetery because this resting place with mossy gravestones and mature leafy trees has the air of permanence, and because across the street is a softball field where some of our sporting writer friends and all of our sons played City League ball for a team called the Montana Review of Books. It was a crazy team, a wonderful team, full of writers and crazy people. Dave loved softball. We were sure he'd enjoy watching his sons run the bases from a box seat in this haven where wide-branched maples drop orange leaves in fall, where willows whisper in summer, and where in spring his personal lilac bushes would waft their perfumes over the earth where he lies. Dave would love to see us doing this, says Lucy as we dig through sod to plant the first young bush. Maybe he's watching us, I say to myself, wondering if his newly freed spirit would be amused at our antics. He loved all of us, says Anne, who has remained my best friend for half a century. Let's see. Skip something. He did it for you, she says, resting her hands on her shovel. What are you talking about? The ranch. He wanted you to have something to hold on to after he was gone. Anne is telling me that Dave wanted the log house we had built in our quarter section of meadow and forest to be a sanctuary for me and the boys. He knew he would not live to see it finished and perfected. Are you positive, I say, my heart sinking? I thought he built our place mostly to please himself. Growing up poor in Depression-era Minnesota, an illegitimate child living with relatives, Dave had dreamed of owning land and horses, dreams I never had until I was in the midst of them. When we bought the ranch, I thought I was enabling him to live his fantasy, if only for a few years. But he recognized my attachment to that land and understood I would never leave it. He knew I would hold on to what I loved until I could grasp no longer. He knew me better than I know myself. Over the next decade, Dave would be joined in the Missoula Catholic Cemetery by Dick Hugo, with a nook for Jim Welch and another for our house-building carpenter-writer friend Eric Johnson, all cut down in their prime. I'd like to imagine those aging boys emerging in moonlight among headstones of pioneers and nuns, war vets and babies dead from influenza. They are telling shaggy dog stories and raunchy jokes, laughing and drinking and playing ball. The party goes on without the rest of us, but some come to visit. I arrive at the cemetery each May 8th with a bouquet of 6 red roses, 1 for each Smith, and a jar full of dogtooth violets and shooting stars picked from our meadow and woods. Eric and Becca usually drive down from Kalispell. Often Steve and Alex are there for the cemetery ritual, and these days Dave is visited by Andrew and his little girls Tilly and Elodie. The girls race around gravestones or perch on Dave's black marble marker, sing songs, and pay scant attention as Andrew recites verses from Rilke. It was lilac time in Missoula when Dave died. The city's bungalows and brick apartments framed with bushes taller than a footballer's head. Its deserted lots lined with old plantings free for the taking. I've tried to grow lilacs by my house in the meadow, wanting flowering bushes like those in this lilac forest in Waterton Oasis, but I always fail. Once I planted a lilac over the carcass of our German shepherd, Sylvie. It withered and died. And I recently planted a shrub in a wet spot by our woodshed. It was nibbled to death by deer. Bill tells me that my meadow is too cold for lilacs, but lilacs are the hardiest of species. Perhaps they are meant to exist on our Montana homestead only in my memory and imagination. Now, at this rest stop near Minnesota's western border, the weight of moist air, the thick grass, and cloying fragrances tell me I have crossed from the prairies of adulthood into the heartland of my youth. I pick a handful of blossoms. No matter how these lilacs came to be, they move me to tears. Lilacs are for me a memorial to desire. I festoon the Forerunner windshield with purple flowers. For a time briefer than first love, their sweetness will offset the pungent odor of western sage that droops from my rearview mirror. Now for something a little lighter. I went to Chicago and I picked up my mother from her old age residence, which is a big, tall glass apartment building, and took her to the dunes to Sawyer. And we were just having fun there and vacationing there. And Bill called from Montana and said his brother Pat had had a heart attack, and then he later said his brother died 2 days later. And so I cut my trip short and went back as fast as I could by a different route across the plains. And this happens while I'm still there and before I head back. And it's called Impressionistic. I'll just say a little bit about my mother. There's a lot in here about her. But she was very tiny, and she was very funny, and she was full of mischief all the time. And we all loved her, although there were times when she could be just unbearable. She was a mother, that's right, just like we all are. So this is called Impressionistic. My niece Celia had come to visit us. Celia leaves. Marie-Jeanne was a French friend of my mother. My mother had grown up in Transylvania and went to Paris as a young woman, became a French citizen. That's where I was born, met my father there. He was also a Hungarian Jew refugee. And so my mother adored everything French, especially the language. And so that was a way to get to her heart, is to speak French. She had a friend named Marie-Jeanne who was French. Celia leaves. Marie-Jeanne distracts Mom with her ongoing Scrabble competition. I have an S, says Mom. I put it here, simp. Simp is not a word. Yes, I have heard my grandchildren say it. Marie-Jeanne opens the dictionary. There is no simp. Mom will not relent. It's a hilarious duo, the nearly deaf Hungarian French-English-speaking centenarian trying to cheat her honest but competitive French friend. Later we walk down the road to the church camp picnic area by the stream. Mom and I hold hands and stop often. Tall beeches are in leaf, berry-brush blooms, and wildflowers sprinkle yellow and white, blue, and pink in the clearing. Bruno was tuned in to our elegiac mood. When we reach the clearing at the end of our road and rest on a picnic bench, he sits at Mother's feet. Marie-Jeanne, who is shy of this big animal, pats his head. He puts his heavy paw on her knee. Good boy, she says. When we turn to retrace our steps, I stand apart studying the scene. I see us as figures in an impressionist painting. Here is the fractured light, a medley of pastels. The bent old woman leans on her cane. Her companion holds her arm. The daughter walks behind, a brown dog at her heel. At the cottage, I think of Pat. That was Bill's brother, Pat. Some of you may have known Pat Kittredge. I don't know. At the cottage, I think of Pat all day long. Pat loved to come to the ranch for dinner, to sit on our deck in the warm season, smoking and drinking gin and tonics with Bill. I have snapshots of Pat leaning back in a red metal chair. He resembles his father, Oscar, who also preferred that chair. We would dip chips into salsa and look out at grazing cattle, or down the canyon where Bear Creek runs through timbered slopes toward the Big Blackfoot River. It must have reminded those men of the MC Ranch in eastern Oregon that each had left behind, but only a little. You call this Jack Pine Flat a ranch? There's nothing worth calling a ranch in all of western Montana, says Bill, with the pride of a dispossessed prince. The ranch the brothers grew up on ran to thousands of acres of plowed meadows planted with grains. Its irrigated marshlands harbored white pelicans and head-high grass, and the miles of high, arid sagebrush prairies they leased from the BLM were rimmed by buttes where antelope multiplied in herds of prehistoric dimensions. As boys and young men, Bill and Pat harvested grain by the boxcar load, drank beer with the hired hands, and drove cattle across the desert like the horseback cowboys they were. That Western youth stamped Pat indelibly as it stamped Bill, but Bill could bring the ranch back in stories and essays. Pat had no such release. He couldn't go home to his lost ranch and family, and he couldn't settle down. The pattern began when Pat flunked out of Stanford, where his father had insisted he go. He felt out of place and refused to attend classes. Then he joined the Army, worked on his family's ranch, sold auto parts in Phoenix, owned a Western wear store, was twice married and divorced, got a degree in philosophy, went to law school, practiced law, was disbarred, became a grandfather, and ended his life a janitor. Pat was my kind of country and Western anti-hero. Fair-haired, charming, damaged, self-defeating, smart-assed, and just plain smart. He was a natural athlete and a picture of grace. Pat had been a star baseball player in high school until he wrecked his knee. He was a daunting pool player and a low-handicap golfer. I close my eyes and see him standing tall on an elevated tee. His swing is fluid and elegant. I hear the clean ring of metal striking ball. I see the long arc of the shot flying high and into the blue. I can't mourn Pat without thinking of Bill. I imagine him sitting on his leather couch in his book-piled apartment in Missoula. The dusty Venetian blinds are drawn. His ashtray brims with cigarette butts. His bed is unmade. Framed photos of childhood sprinkle the walls. Bill and Pat in boots and chaps, quick-drawing toy pistols. Bill, Pat, and little sister Roberta dangling their feet off the back of a horse-pulled wagon, a portrait of his beloved German blacksmith grandfather in suit and tie, and in the place of honor, his mother Josephine, peering out of an oval frame, demure, in her fur-trimmed coat, her dark hair glowing, nothing like the regal, overweight matron I knew, wearing diamonds and mink, her bleached hair piled in a lacquered beehive. Bill must have felt beyond bereft. His son Brad and daughter Karen and his 4 grandsons will surely call offering sympathy, but they are busy with work, school, and family in Portland and Seattle, and if they offer to fly to Missoula, Bill will tell them thanks, but no thanks. Aside from me, he has no one with whom to share his grief. He needs me, and he needs me soon. So that's when I head back. I was going to read you a little thing about country and western and Hank Williams, but I think I'll skip that. It's getting long. So I headed back west. And I'm trying to find, I got this marked wrong. Okay, I'm going to read you a little piece about, that takes place in the sandhills of Nebraska, an area that I just love. And so it's called, there's 2 sections, one is Old Jules and the other is Young Jules. Old Jules. Driving toward Chadron, I face a circle of blinding light. I move slowly toward the glare, squinting despite sunglasses and thankful the highway is as deserted as the grasslands it cuts through. At last, the haze that masks the horizon swallows the sun. What remains is a purplish band outlined in glittering orange. The land darkens, driving becomes automatic, and my mind turns inward. My first sight of this country was in June 1978. I'd flown to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, rented a car, and headed east into the Sandhills. My mission was to delve into the place and family that had inspired the Nebraska writer Mari Sandos. I had a company of women called Wilderness Women Productions, and that's who started and made that film Heartland. That was our group, and we were none of us professional. Anyway, we did it. My mission was to delve into the place and family that had inspired the Nebraska writer Mari Sandos. Our Wilderness Women production company in Missoula had decided to film Eleanor Stewart's Wyoming homesteader story, the film that would become Heartland, as the pilot for a projected series, and we were looking for the next good frontier woman's tale to follow into production. I knew something of Mari's history, but had only book learning about the place that sparked her imagination. If I were to write a script about her life, I had to put my feet on her ground. Mari was born in 1896 in her father's post office shack overlooking the Niobrara River. The eldest of 6 children, and by rules of female primogeniture, the nursemaid for the rest. She grew up on homesteads hidden in the grassland swells that I am passing through now. Her father, Jules Sandos, became both famous and infamous through her unflinchingly candid portrayal of him in her 1935 memoir, Old Jules, one of the great narratives of the Pioneer West. If you haven't read it, you really should. On his deathbed, Jules surprised Mari by asking her to write his life story. It was an odd request, as he had never encouraged her before. In fact, when she published her first short story at age 11, he had slapped her face and locked her in the cellar. Fiction, Jules shouted, is only fit for hired girls. Years later, he told her, "You know, I consider artists and writers the maggots of society." These are quotes. But as he lay dying, he realized that his only passage to immortality would be through the words of his writer daughter. And I'm going to skip a part here. Mari Sandos escaped her father's orbit as soon as she could, only to fall into a similar trap. At 17, with only an 8th grade education, she became a country school teacher. A year later, she married a neighboring rancher, and at 23 divorced him for extreme mental cruelty. Then she fled to Lincoln, Nebraska, where she wrote constantly, lived in poverty, attended classes at the University of Nebraska, and suffered the predictable failures of a woman writer from the backcountry. Her breakthrough book, Old Jewels, was rejected by 13 publishers before a revised version won a prize from the Atlantic and was published in 1935. Its success enabled her to move to Denver, then to New York. She settled in Greenwich Village, where she enjoyed the bohemian pleasures of a city woman, the discipline of a researcher, and the satisfactions of a writer who published more than 20 books, including Cheyenne Autumn, Crazy Horse, and The Cattleman. She never married again, had no children, and died of bone cancer in 1966. But like many Western-bred artists who grew up in rural isolation, poverty, or both, like friends of mine such as Judy Blunt, Mary Clearman Blue, Bill Kittredge, James Welch, and Richard Hugo, Mary Sandos's imagination resided in the home that drove her away. Through discovery of this region, she wrote of the Sandhills, "This one drop of water, I hope to discover something of the nature of the ocean." That's what we all do. So now we come to young jewels. A green-black bloom settles over the Sandhills. I look north toward darkening grasslands, and my thoughts turn from Mari to her younger brother known as Young Jules. It was a lucky day when I met him about 25 years ago, the day I first drove into these Sandhills. I catch my breath, realizing how fast of a quarter of a century slips by, and yet his presence is imprinted in my memory as it is on this landscape. The afternoon was breezy, with tawny-topped grasses swaying under a June sun. Grazed dunes dipped and swelled around me. The land was barren of trees or any break from the blue horizontal, save for an occasional shack or windmill. I parked at a crossroads where the blacktop met up with a dirt track. A tall, thin, old cowboy eased out of a maroon 1960s vintage Mercury. This was Young Jules, square-jawed, blue-eyed, and courtly in pressed Levi's, polished cowboy boots, and a straw Stetson. He had come to lead me to his sister's ranch. Still handsome at 80, Young Jules glanced sideways at me from time to time. Oh wait, I skipped the good part. No, no telling where you'd end up, he said, sizing me up as a dude. Jules opened the door on the passenger side, and we took off in his rattling rig, careening almost airborne on dusty ranch roads at speeds no sane person would dare. Still handsome at 80, Young Jules glanced sideways at me from time to time, a naughty half smile daring me to flinch. I held tight, knowing this was a test. He slowed down once to point out Mari's grave. Further on, he nodded at a fork in the road. "That's the way to the home place. We'll go there tomorrow." We pulled into Carolyn Sandos Piper's driveway in a splatter of dust and gravel. The youngest Sandos sister lived with her husband in a neat, 60s-style, two-level ranch house with picture windows looking out to the open pastures of their ranch. Carolyn was a trim, well-spoken woman and a gracious host, but hesitant about spilling any more family secrets than Mari had already revealed in her books. For instance, she didn't tell me the Sandos children grew up speaking German, or that, to hold his claim under the Kincaid Act, Old Jules had sent 14-year-old Mari and 10-year-old Young Jules to camp on a homestead miles away for 4 months, expecting them to survive on what they could scrounge. But she did quiz me about our small corporation's plans for a movie. The film my partners and I had in mind, I told her, would not be a celebrity story about Mari or a biography of Old Jules. It would be based on the life of their mother, Marlizzie, her experience as an immigrant, mail-order bride, and then as a mother of 6 who managed the family ranch with little help from her husband. Carolyn was evasive. Other producers had been in touch with the family about television or movie projects based on Mari's life and books. I inferred from her tone that she believed those others had deeper pockets, better connections, and more likely chances for success than a group called Wilderness Women from Missoula, Montana. We'll talk about it and I'll get back to you, she said. I knew she never would. Young Jules joked and laughed as he drove me to the home place next morning. The ranch had gone to his sister Flora, in overalls and work boots with cropped hair and a strong, stout body. Flora was the frontier woman I had expected Carolyn to be. She nodded politely when Jules told her I wanted to make a movie about her mother. I talked about our plan to depict as honestly as we could the lives of homestead women, but I don't think she believed me. How could this frizzy-haired, obviously urban woman in jeans and polished boots have the faintest notion about her mother's character or life? Flora showed me around the barn and chicken coop and pointed out a few old apple trees that Jules had planted, as well as some struggling cottonwoods. Trees, she said, he wanted to plant trees out here. On our way back to my rental car, young Jules drove more slowly. He quizzed me about my life in Montana, my sons, my status as a widow. He was flirtatious and charming, disappointed when I told him I had a steady boyfriend. Watch out for Jules, Carolyn had advised before we left her place that morning. He likes you. Then, with a softening of voice and a concerned wrinkling of her forehead, she added, you know, he has cancer, incurable. He don't show it, but he's 80, a very sick man. When we arrived at the crossroads, Jules stopped the car but did not get out. He leaned toward me, grabbed my shoulders, and planted a big kiss on my lips. What the hell, I laughed. He laughed. Then he opened his door and came round to escort me toward my vehicle. After I was in the driver's seat, my bag stowed in the trunk, my briefcase beside me, young Jules stood a moment looking down at me. He tipped his Stetson. Now, he said, you can tell those folks in Montana you've been kissed by a real cowboy. One very short little piece to read, and then that will be the end of it. This is called The End of the Road. I finally get back home. I'm too late for the dinner that Bill is giving and Steve is giving for his brother, but I get there. This is called End of the Road. At Bonner, I exit the freeway and make the turn up Highway 200. I do not glance at the Milltown Bar, another memory vortex, for Dick Hugo is not on my mind, although a beam ditch is. As we wind through the narrow canyon of the Big Blackfoot, the river ripples silver in moonlight, a lopsided moon above zigzag pines on the logged-off hillsides. Bruno perks up, circles restless on his bed. I wonder if he recognizes the feel and flow of this familiar canyon passage. He moans softly, trying to tell me he wants out. I take a dog treat from its bag and hold it behind my head. I love the moist, gentle touch of Bruno's nose on my palm. I give him another treat. Almost there, baby boy. Here at last is the turnoff to Bear Creek Road. My butt is so sore it's numb. My eyes are blurring. There is a dull pain in my right thigh. It is past 9 in the evening, and I've been pushing the pedal for more than 12 hours. I'm too old for this, I think. Never again. About 1.5 miles up the road, I pass a row of mailboxes, not stopping to open mine. We bump over the first cattle guard and tunnel through pines on both sides of the gravel track. Metal roofs gleam on new houses at the edge of the forest. The overgrazed pasture on our left has gone to dirt. We pass tricles, deserted, double-wide set up on blocks, and the forest closes right up to my gate. When I bump over my cattle guard, the meadow opens to the light of the moon. Black, white-faced Hereford cows and calves with new brands scabbed on their haunches clutter our rutted road. These belong to the Wills family, who have put their cows out on our pasture every Memorial Day since our first spring in 1971, when Ernest and dark-haired Sydney rode horseback to the little house to ask for permission. I honk the horn. The animals scatter. I open the metal gate that leads to our driveway, shooing away a few insistent mamas and babies. Our white chinked log house is lit upstairs and down, looming in the new grass like a ship at sea. My ship, my sea. Bruni, I cry, we're home. module on. Anyway, if you have any questions or want to talk about anything, I'm glad to. Yes, ma'am.
I'm an amateur writer,
Uh-huh.
and my dog Molly and I were leaving for a 2-week trip. I decided to take her on vacation,
Good for you.
and this is a vacation for her. We're going to a warm, sunny beach where we can throw tennis balls. And
You won't like it at all.
Anyway, I wanted to do something like this. I want to document it and write about it, and I was just wondering if you have any suggestions. Did you?
I kept a journal.
Jenna?
I'm not a very good journal keeper because I don't like to read what I've written in it after I've write it. But I did keep a journal which said where I was, when, and anything that kind of struck me as interesting or unusual. And I took snapshots. I took a camera. I originally wanted this book to have those snapshots in them, but my publisher said no. So anyway, the snapshots are great memory keys. And so and then it depends on what kind of book you want to write. I mean, I decided I would write this unconventional kind of free association book, which is a very hard book to sell. If you want to write a straight journey story travel book, you can do that. If you want to write about your dog, I mean, you have to decide what kind of book you want to write, and then give it a try.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments? God. Yes, sir.
Was it difficult to decide what to leave out?
It took me 7 years, yeah. It was very, I mean, at one point I had written little stories about every dog we ever had. I loved it, doing that, and it was really fun. And my, reader read it, and my editor read it and said, those dogs have to go. You can do another book with those dogs. So I just put Bruno in here, and I get Lulu in at the end. Lulu is in there at the end. So that was what, I mean, it was very hard to try and figure what goes with what and what comes next and how to, I mean, the journey itself is the spine, so there's no getting away from that. But it's what happens, or what you think of, or who you think of, or, that's hard to figure out. But fun, yeah.
You said it took 7 years. Was that 7 years to write the book, or
It's 7 years. I mean, it wasn't a straight 7 years of sitting at my desk and writing. It was a lot of on and off writing. But over 7 years, I edited and re-edited and re-edited. Alex and Andrew can tell you they read early versions this book, and just trying to figure out how to make it work to my satisfaction and to readers. Then, of course, you get an editor, as you well know, and the editor says, well, this is very nice, but you need to cut this and this and this. And you go, oh my gosh, I love that and that and that. But you cut them anyway. Dick Hugo said once, the best way, when you can cut your favorite lines from a poem for the sake of the poem, then you're on your way to becoming a writer. So we know that about films, we know that about poems, we know that about everything, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What's next?
Oh, I'm working on I did an anthology a couple of years ago about prairies, with photographs and essays by writers, including like Matheson and poem from Harrison, McGuane, Gretel Ehrlich. A lot of friends of mine wrote about prairies, and we had very beautiful black and white photographs. And I edited it with Susan O'Connor, who was a great friend of mine and a wonderful philanthropist and woman. And she came up with the idea that we should do a book about hearth. So I'm working on this book, which will be a collection, we hope, of mostly original writings by writers from all around the world, famous writers and not such well-known writers, about their ideas of meaning of heart and hearth. And you know, the English word hearth combines heart and earth. And so that's sort of what got us started on this. And we now have about 35 writers who said they would be part of it, including Pico Iyer. And there's a poem by Merwin. There's writers from Asia. Carl Safina, whose wonderful book Beyond Words, it's just published about what animals feel and think. I recommend it highly to everyone. All kinds of people have said they would, so that's what I'm working now. We're putting together a book proposal. I hope to get someone to publish it. Nothing else? Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Oh.